Okay, so we're recording. Hello, good morning. Welcome to Econ 101. And people are coming in. Excellent. My name is Gabriel Domingo again, and this is Econ 101 for this semester. Ang gagawin po natin this online first session is to do talk about the syllabus first. So naka-online na po, na-upload ko na ang syllabus natin for Econ 101, but we'll be flashing that and talking a little bit about what you expect to learn, what materials will you be doing, and what sort of exams or homework you'll be expecting from this class. This class is also face-to-face. It's just that this week, because of the bar exam, they asked if it's possible to move the lecture online. Also, I read somewhere, and I have to talk to Dr. Carl Handok. It seems to be that they're trying to encourage more online work. Like some of it will definitely be online, but I have to ask. But I would definitely prefer na face-to-face para magkita lahat tayo, and then we can work on the materials together at the same time in the same place. So that's me. I guess I'd like to pause here first and ask if there are any concerns about yung face-to-face. Okay lang, I guess everyone is on board with the face-to-face policy. Meron tayong Q&A. Meron ba tayong chat dito? Meron ring chat. Kung gusto niyo magsalita, pwede rin kayong mag-on. I think naka-on yun yung mic ninyo or kaya niyo yung on yung mic. Okay, great. So I've seen some thumbs up. Okay. So right now, I will just talk about our syllabus, okay? And then ask questions about, ask you guys if you have any concerns about the syllabus. And then we'll take a break. And then we'll restart again. And I will record our first lecture on the science of macro and a little bit about some of the data in macroeconomics. And then we will meet again next week to finish up the data of macro and to continue on with the lecture. Having said that, basically our class sana will go from 8. I'll be there at school for starting 8, pero I guess we can wait until like 8:20 to 8:30 for people to come in. It depends really kung ano yung. This is actually my first time to teach face-to-face as well. So I would like to know kung mahihirapan yung taong pumasok. So I'm willing to wait for like 30 minutes. But having said that, from 8, hopefully by 8:20 to 8:30, magsa-start tayo. So magtatapos po tayo ng mga 11 to 11:30 para pwede na kayo mag-lunch ng maaga. And then somewhere between 8:30 to 11:30, magbe-break rin tayo ng 10 minutes. So essentially, it's the same thing as what's happening now, except I guess this online class will be a little quicker than the one in face-to-face. Okay, so let me now share a document. Okay, so here is our syllabus. Na-upload ko na ito sa UVLE. And hopefully everyone has a copy of it, but we should run through it right now. So this is my email, gbdomingo@up.edu.ph. Some of you also know my Gmail, pwede rin yun, but for class purposes, let's just use the up.edu.ph. Our class schedule is technically 8 to 12, but we'll try to start 8:20, 8:30, and then we'll end 11:30 to 11:35. So we can have an early start to lunch on site. So what are the goals for Economics 101? Okay. To understand macroeconomic variables, such as GDP and inflation, among other things, with a focus on Philippine context. So, importante yung Philippine context because our textbook here is Gregory Mankiw, 10th edition. Pwede ring earlier. I don't mind. In fact, I have a PDF copy of the older textbook. So pwede rin natin gamitin yun. The purpose of using ManQ really is to use ManQ on principles and the theory and maybe a little bit about the American or US experience. Yung problema kasi yung US experience at yung Philippine experience magkaiba talaga. And ngayon pa lang, in just first lecture, makikita niyo yung pagkakaiba. Hindi maiiwasan na iba talaga because we are a lower middle income country and our statistical capabilities are actually quite good for our income level, pero hindi siya kasing level ng United States, of course. Tsaka EU. And then there are other readings to be assigned during the semester. So this is completely optional. It depends on whether we have time. Also, ipapakiramdamin ko rin sa inyo kung ano yung mga gusto ninyong pag-usapan. But there are other potential things that we can read about. Other than yung textbook natin. These other readings will focus really on economics, macroeconomics research sa Pilipinas as it relates to yung topics na pinapag-aralan natin. So during the course, as we're going through the material, we will introduce some of this material. And if it's introduced in the as part of the course, of course, if I teach it, then it will be part of your evaluation, like the midterms and the final. All right, and the next is to, well, we already talked a little bit about this, to understand the theories and understand government policy, relating these different macroeconomic variables. And as you'll see, these macroeconomic variables are intrinsically related to the government policy that seeks to influence these macroeconomic variables. And that will happen, you will see that more clearly later on. And then at the end of our course, probably in the last month, we'll be talking about economic growth and a little bit about what's called quote-unquote development economics. So in economics, it's very interesting. Pag may macroeconomics ka, in a developing country context, development economics ang tawag doon. So a lot of people use that sort of nomenclature. But again, we will talk about economic growth in the large, in theory niya, and then we will apply it as much as possible to the Philippine case. As you may expect, there's been a lot of studies on Philippine economic growth, which we will draw on. Okay, so ano ang ating assessment? So magkakaroon po tayo ng midterm at final. Okay. Ito yung schedule natin for the course, which we will try our best to follow. If not, well, kung kulang, for example, if we were not able to finish here, right, then we will continue on for the next, magsa-spill over siya to the next date, and so on and so forth. So I'm hoping to finish Chapter 1 and 2 and Chapter 3 by next week, sa September 25. Okay lang yun. And then by next week, there will be a homework and this so-called macro news, which I will be talking about soon. So the midterm and the final will be 50%. Si midterm natin is mangyayari ng November 6, covering topics from September 18 until October 30. And then yung final natin will be, well, hindi pa natin alam, may announce pa nila. But usually mga first week ng January, maybe second week ng January, ganun. And that will happen, that will take into account yung classes from November 13 until I think the last class is December 18. And then may Christmas break and then yung exam is pagbalik ng January yata. Next is, importante po ang homework. So it will be an important chunk, 30%. So every other week sana, magkaka-homework tayo, okay, starting next week. So specifically this afternoon, so how will the homework be done? I will be doing yung homework using Uvle. So sa Uvle, isa-set up ko yung homework listing. Those are basically questions from either the textbook or from some other source, pero related dun sa pinapag-aralan natin, syempre. So for example, tonight or later this afternoon, I will be writing up the homework and yung homework na yan will be due on September 25. iniisip ko na may option na i-submit yung homework online using, again, Oble, using yung pag-upload ng material. Pwede nyo ring i-submit in person, pero para hindi na kayo mag-print, anuhin nyo na lang, i-upload nyo na lang. Pwede rin kasing isulat, no? So actually, hindi na kailangan mag-print, no? Sinusulat lang pala to sa papel. So pwede nyo ring ibigay sa akin in person. So kayo yung bahala. Okay lang yun, either way. Pero we will be strict on the deadlines. So when you give it, dapat September 25 during class, or kung online, before the end of class, ma-upload nyo. All right? So medyo we'll try to be strict regarding that deadline. Okay. So we have homework, right? And that homework, I ask you guys to work independently and try your best and put in some effort into it. It's meant really to exercise your understanding of the material, right? It's not meant to like really challenge you. Like it's not really supposed to be a challenging question. It's really meant to make sure you understand the material. So my suggestion, in general, not just for this class, but for all other classes, but for this class, to really take the homework seriously, because not only does it have a large chunk of the final grade, but it will also help you do well dito sa midterm and sa final. Okay. And then finally, dito sa we have a final assessment tool. Ay, salamat po. Nag-work na po. Salamat. Nagpapa-insta lang ako ng something. Meron ako klase. Salamat po. Okay na po. Thank you. Nakuha niyo ng pera? Salamat. Nagpapa-install ako ng LPG. So, nung bago nag-start yung klase. Okay. So, ito na po ang macro news. So, on some selected dates, pwede kayong maghanap in advance, right? Selected dates, submit a link or screen grab of a macro topic related news or essay for the week with a brief discussion. So dito sa macro news, I'm thinking of moving this macro news to October 2, actually. So why don't we do that right now? Para without pressure. Kasi matatapos tayo ng macro and macro measurement and national income by next week. And then you can start looking for some macro news starting today relating to GDP and GNP and inflation starting, well, after this class. Pero you can submit it in October 2 instead. So we're changing this and I'll probably re-upload this later. Let me just take a re-upload. Okay, re-upload syllabus. So yeah, so what this is let's talk about it. Okay. So in macro news, just screenshot a news article, an essay, right? It can be anything, but sana include the date and source. Newer topics or newer news is better. Okay. Than older, pero pwede rin yung older, depending. It's up to you. It's really, this is how you express your like your interest and your understanding of the topic by looking for the appropriate or good news article. Pwede rin social media, like a Twitter post or what's the other one? Sorry, I'm just a Twitter guy. I don't know what the others are. Ano ba yung iba? WhatsApp. Ano yun? WhatsApp. Ano yun? Messaging yun. Anyway, kung ano man yung mga iba. TikTok. That's what I'm thinking. Sa TikTok, for example, pwedeng ganun din. Screenshot nyo lang and then i-explain nyo. Kasi TikTok is a video. So we cannot really put it in the upload. Okay, so for these ones, explain nyo kung ano yung essay. I-summarize mo yung exact point na gusto mong tutukan. And then include any questions or thoughts that you think about when it comes to connecting si course at saka yung news. Okay. So next week, I'll try to give an example of that and I'll try to find my own news article and I'll share it with everyone next week when nag-face-to-face na tayo. But generally, there will be 5 macro news because there are like 5 broad topics. And the first macro news will be on macro statistics. So may GDP, GNP, unemployment statistics, and CPI or inflation statistics, right? So my concern here really is it's not, I would say for the first macro news, try to think about measurement and the theory behind the statistics first, because we'll be dealing with income determination, inflation determination, um, unemployment determination later on. So actual news articles regarding inflation and so on and how it affects the people and the macroeconomy can come in later. Pero dun sa first one, if you can look for anything about measurement of GDP, growth in GDP, and how things are measured about GDP or GNP or inflation, articles like that, and then connect it to what we're talking about here. So macro news really here is really more about understanding either the theory of it or the measurement of it. Okay. So there are lots of interesting ways of thinking about that. So don't really think about what inflation is and how it affects people, or what GDP growth is and how it affects people. That will come out later on, because in macro news 2 we'll be doing inflation and monetary policy, monetary system. And then we'll be talking about unemployment directly in macro news 4, and then GDP growth. So news about GDP growth can happen. You can talk about GDP growth here in macro news 5. So iba si macro news 1, it's really more about measurement and theory. And here are the additional readings, which are indicated here. All of these should be largely available online. You can download a lot of these things. Kasi these are working papers from PIDS, from ADB. So pwede mo silang mahanap online. And these are, some of them are old and some of them are, released or uploaded somewhere. So you can check it out. Some of these are coming from books as well, like collections of papers in economics. As you will find that out when you Google it. Okay. So that's it. I guess let me just show you at this point. This is the book that I've got online, and this is largely the book that I'll follow. When I get to school, I should check to see chapter 10. I'm sorry, chapter 10. It's 10th edition versus itong 7th edition. To my mind, these are quite similar, and you can use the 7th edition. Again, you can Google it, and then you can just download it. Pwede nyo ring hiramin somewhere, si Gregory Mankiw, anywhere between 7th and 10th edition. Okay lang sa akin. We will use Mankiw really for economic theory and basically as the guide towards all of the big picture topics here in this course. I guess one last thing about the macro news, I will be about submission. So the submission dates will also be serious. Okay, these are the dates, right? Try not to be late. I will set up Uvle to also accept the macro news part. Meron rin tayong 1 page in total. So also keep that in mind. That's part of the assessment. Are you able to, in 1 page, summarize the article or social media properly? And then to relate it to our course, or to ask interesting, you don't even need to come up with unique insights regarding the connection between the article and our course. You can write about what questions it made you ask, what you made you think about, and then maybe that's something that can be discussed in class. No? Babasahin ko yung mga macro news ninyo, and then we'll be talking about it in the following week. Pwede rin siguro na, kasi iniisip ko na yung mga news na yan, pwede kong i-integrate in future iterations of this course, because I think we really need to have an interesting, like Philippine-centric point of view or course design for macroeconomics. So this is in a sense getting some of sort of crowdfunding that effort para tulungan nyo kung maintindihan kung ano yung mga sinusulat about macroeconomics about the Philippines and about interesting articles about these topics. So we can integrate all of that into this course right now and in future courses as well. Okay, so any questions at all regarding our syllabus?
Sir, I have a question. About the macro news po, I'm assuming po that the news has to be in a national level po? Or
Well, it's macroeconomics, as we will find out, is usually defined at the macro level. So yes, pero pwede ring international, meaning comparing different economies, national economies. Pwede ring ganun. Pwede ring for a particular kind of person or particular people, how they relate or how they understand, macro level ideas, right? So for example, a good idea dun sa measurement is, an article explaining, how do people think about GDP? How do they think about how it's measured versus how it's actually measured? Parang ganun. There are some articles about that na like perceptions, consumer perceptions on inflation and how that differs from the actual inflation. May mga articles na ganun. Very interesting. So yeah, I hope you guys will at least try to look for some interesting measurement-related articles on GDP, GNP, inflation, unemployment, and so on. Because right now we're really thinking about in theory and in measurement before the actual issues on inflation and GDP, right? Which will come later in the course. All right. So any other questions? Thank you very much for the question. Maraming salamat po. I will turn this off. How do I turn this off? I can't. Oh, stop share. Sorry. It's very clear. Okay. So I'm done. So I'm just going to wait for like another minute if there are any questions regarding the scores and everything I talked about in the syllabus. May question si Sir Almonte. Is the 9th edition all right to use? Yes. Anything 7th and onwards. I've checked actually online kung ano yung mga topics, ano yung mga chapters. Nagbabago ng konti yung page number, nagbabago ng konti yung mga chapters. But all of the topics should be there from from 7th edition all the way to the 10th edition. So it shouldn't really be a problem which one you use. Again, I'll try to, the reason why I think it's okay is because this is really a theory, and the theory has been well established for like years now, decades, especially at this point, at this level of teaching this course. So it doesn't, it's fine to go slightly older as long as we're not going back to the 50s. But nagbago if you think about economic history of thought sa macro. Medyo malaking pagbabago during the 80s to the, so wag tayong bumalik ng 80s and 90s. Back when I was still trying to learn it, I went back to the 80s, 90s. Iba-iba yung treatment. So anything like in the 2000s should be fine. It's only later on when medyo advanced na yung panapag-aralan natin. That's the only time when more current treatment would be somewhat more appropriate. And importante nga rin yung Philippine context. So as much as possible, I'll try my best to really bring in some Philippine research. After discussing the base theory and how the theory works, we'll be trying to bring in some Philippine-based information. Especially in this first part on measurement, we've got really good data on all of these macroeconomic variables. But as you'll see, after the break, you'll see that there's a lot of theorizing and estimation that has to be done as well, even for the United States. But that doubly includes the Philippines as well. So that will be an interesting thing to learn about. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so having said that, let me now pause the recording and we can come back in 10 minutes and I will do a recorded lecture on the science of macroeconomics and a little bit about the measurement. And that will probably run for an hour. I don't want it to be too long kasi parang video size nagbaba, mahirap. So anyway, we'll definitely finish all of this by next week. It's very, very possible to finish this mag face-to-face na tayo. And then, later on, tonight or tomorrow, I'll be uploading this video either on YouTube or on Uvle. And then I will also be writing down what the homework is. And the homework is due next week. And the macro news will be delayed, not next week, but the week following. Okay. And let me just note that I'll be writing all of this down as well. Writing sa announcements. So just to make sure everyone who happens to be not here, because currently there are 37, there should be about 45 people total. And I'll be asking, I'll be making sure to write everything I've mentioned or announced here in this video and write it down in announcements natin. Everyone can access our page, yes? Is there anyone here who cannot access UVLE, our 101, which I've been using already? Yes, Mr. Baluyot, go ahead.
Hello, sir. Am I audible po?
Opo, go ahead.
Wala pa po ko dun sa course for Econ 101 on UVL po.
So wala ka pang access sa Uble? Yeah, I guess that's what it means, yeah? Kung wala. Okay. So, I guess, Abraham, pag tutukan natin to para ma-access ka na, para makapasok ka na sa Uble. So, let me just write that down. Si Abraham. Kasi next week na yung homework. And I guess, let me, so to Abraham specifically, can we try to figure out Uble by the end of the week? Or kung by the end of the week wala, to Abraham Baluyot specifically, please email me. And then pwede kong ipadala sa'yo tomorrow yung homework. Okay? Abraham, are you there? Or nawala ka na? Wala ba si Abraham? Nawala siya. But it's okay because I think I have his email kasi nag-email na kami before. So i-email ko na lang siya. Any other people with the problems accessing Uvle, especially this week, because you'll need it this week to access the videos and whatever the homework is? Go ahead.
I don't have access pa po, but I'm the one who pre-rog.
Okay, so Shannon Morikawa. So again, Shannon, pa-email na lang po and then I can send you the homework and the link to the video and all of that stuff for this week. And sana tukan natin sana this week and or sometime next week matapos na rin siya. Ma-connect ka na.
Thank you po.
Napadala mo na ba sa akin yung pre-rog form?
I can send it right now po.
Sige, para ma-signan ko na, tapos babalik ko pa sa'yo, di ba?
Alright, thank you.
So, kailangan, ang daming mangyari. Ang daming kailangan mangyari para ma-connect. And then, si Abraham yata, last week ko pa sinainan yung form. Hanggang ngayon, wala pa. So, yun. So, for the people na hindi nakaka-access, so homework, for example, pwede nating start, I guess, a way for us to work around that as well. Pag nasa regular class na tayo, pwede ko nang ilagay doon kung ano yung homework. Except that until, iniisip ko kasi every week kung ano yung magandang homework depending kung ano yung pinag-uusapan natin. So, ayoko rin ilagay doon yung homework unless alam ko na gagawin natin yun. So right now, I'm still not really there yet as to how, to write down specifically the homework before we've actually gone through the material. So, magmamaterial muna tayo and then saka ako i-match sa homework para talagang it will exercise your understanding of the material that we discussed. All right, for these two people, anyone else na may problema? Oh, so for anyone, if you know anyone else na may problema, just email me at the up.edu address, and then I will send links on the video and the homework. And sana by next week, okay na si Uble, so everyone can access it on UVL. Any other questions? Okay, having no questions, I will now pause the recording and then I'll come back in 10 minutes and then tayo. I-continue ko yung lecture. I'll see you all in 10 minutes or so. Hello, everyone. I'm back. So right now, I'm going to live record this lecture. I don't know ano yung experience niyo in the past, but I guess since I'm live recording this, you can interrupt at any time. Having said that, if you can also opt to not be here, and you can just do, if kung may ginagawa ko or gagawin kayo, you can also choose to listen to this live lecture later on. It's up to you. Ngayon lang dahil online siya. But of course, I'm expecting, as much as possible, regular attendance, if not complete attendance for our face-to-face class. And a lively discussion during the face-to-face class. Except that online, parang baka medyo mahirap or mahihirapan tayo. Pati kayo na rin. But having said that, just raise your hand, and if I notice it, I will definitely try to respond. All right. So let's share. Where is sharing? Sharing, let's share it. Okay, so now we're sharing this one. All right. So ito yung ating first lecture, Lecture 1, the science of macro and macroeconomics data. Now, this corresponds to, of course, the ManQ chapters. Again, talking about the science of macroeconomics and the data of macroeconomics. I'm targeting at the end of this recorded lecture will be finished with at least the theoretical notions of GDP, GNP. And then we'll be dealing with some empirical examples when we see each other in person. But the theory should already be enough to prepare you for that sojourn into some of the empirical or the actual working with the data. Something to look forward to next week. Since we have Philippine data, we can download the actual Philippine data for GNP and GDP as well as its components. And then we can flash them on screen, plot them, and do other things. So this is one of the things that we'll be talking about face-to-face, which I think it will be easier if we do that face-to-face. All right, but now in this particular recording, we'll be talking really more about some of the theories and some of the broad topics regarding the science of macro and GDP and GNP specifically. So let's talk about the definition or what macroeconomics is. So may nagtanong na, is it about national level? So the answer is yes, typically, and in this course specifically, macroeconomics is at the level of national economies. So there are these political things called countries or nations, and historically, macroeconomics has been studied at that level. Presumably because yung political groupings na to, which are nations, they have policies set at the national level that affects everyone within that country. So that's why macroeconomics, national level, national macro policy, those are all really intertwined as to why macroeconomics is defined this way. In particular, I can say historically that this more modern take on macroeconomics started at the end of like the Great Depression during basically the 20th century, when countries have decided that they're able to control using government policy different macroeconomic variables, and thus the study of macroeconomics, quote unquote, as the study of national level economies was born. So that goes hand in glove. The government realizing that it can sort of manage through government policy the the output level of the economy, employment and inflation and so on, and how the study or the science of macroeconomics actually began. One of the seminal outputs are turning points, I should say, turning points in history about the study of macroeconomics was the Great Depression, where they realized definitely that macroeconomic policy can have a very, very important effect on whether a country can escape a depression or a recession. And that's when I would say that the macroeconomics as a field essentially was born. Okay, and that's why we're sort of like thinking about later on, just to preview our future chapters, we'll be talking about some of the theories of how GDP is determined, right? Not just measured, but how the level of output is determined and how the level of output is going to grow over time. Okay. All right, but that's for next week, right? So for this week, we'll be talking about, now that we know what that is, it's the study of national level economies or the economies as a whole. Principally, it involves these macro statistics. So when you talk about national level economies, these statistics and other statistics like these are measured at the national level. They could also be measured at the subnational level, which we'll definitely be talking about as well. Because like we said, medyo accident of history tong national level na to. And it's connected really to the government policy, right? But all of these things, GDP, GNP, inflation, unemployment, and so on, can be measured at a smaller aggregation, like in provinces, regions, even cities. Or it can be thought of in terms of the globe, right? The whole world's output, right? But in this case, we'll be definitely focusing on the Philippine national level economies. And then later on, we'll be talking about perhaps there's been work on regional GDP and regional GNP, which we could be talking about in passive later on. Now, macroeconomics is very interesting. A lot of people like fall in love when they do economics, they first fall in love with macro because it's so important to everyone's lives, right? Everyone is interested in how whether the country is growing, whether it's growing properly, whether incomes are rising broadly throughout the economy, whether prices are going up too fast. Maybe they're going too small. It's lethargic, right? The prices are not really rising too fast. That's an indicator that no one's really buying anything and so on. So it really affects of course, unemployment. Unemployment is one of the things that really hits you hits you where it hurts, right? It's your career and your salaries and how you support your family. Pensions, of course, are also a macroeconomic topic because it's also, again, related to employment and how our income, for example, moves from when you're working to when you're not working. So again, pensions, particularly after post-retirement consumption, post-retirement income, these are very, very important topics as well, and it involves all of our lives. And as I'm sure you know, pag nagbabasa kayo ng balita, macroeconomic news definitely are almost always out there. So that's what also inspired me to do this macro news, to encourage you guys to like look at the news and to relate it to what we're talking about in this class now. So medyo may theory, and then we'll try to bring in the Philippines using research. But right now, you guys are looking out into the world and also bringing out the popular opinion, news articles, maybe even opinion articles on all of these topics. And then you can, all of these perspectives are very important. And it really reflects the fact that it's macroeconomics is super important to the lives of everyone. Okay, so that's why it's all over the news and social media. Businesses look to these to assess the health of the country. So for example, pumapasok rin dito yung national level competition, right? Another example of the measurement, for example, would be see Vietnam. Maybe this is another thing that something that you could feature some macro news. Vietnam versus the Philippines, or Philippines versus all of the other Southeast Asian countries. Usually there's a foot race, right? About, the measurement of GDP. And particularly for Vietnam, apparently, and again, maybe you guys can cite the news articles or the opinion articles that say so, that Vietnam has in fact surpassed the GDP per capita of the Philippines. I think that's what happened. I'm not quite sure. You can tell me next week or in 2 weeks. So again, this is very important, and businesses look to that and they say, these countries have a stable inflation, have a good government deficit picture, sustainable debt. By the way, that's not even one of the things we haven't even mentioned. The level of the national debt is also a very important macro statistics that we can study, right? So anyway, businesses are looking at all of these different macro statistics, including GDP and GNP, to decide whether a country is a good investment opportunity or not, is politically stable. And it's also a primary concern for the Philippine government, right? To be able to present this picture of macroeconomic health to foreign investors, because we would like more foreign investment, which would kickstart Philippine development. All of these, of course, will be much clearer later when we talk about economic review as well. But basically all of these stuff is really important. Maybe I should end with the government, right? So the government level statistics on debt and income and taxation, those are also appropriate macroeconomic topics. Of course, if you take a course at UPSE in public economics, dun mas tututok ang taxation policy, debt policy, and so on. But at this level, in this course in 101, the debt and taxation and income at the national government level is also an appropriate topic, because these things are related intrinsically to government fiscal and monetary policy. Okay, how much income and how much taxes they levy and how much debt they incur. And that affects not just current consumption. Of course, that's the reason why you have debt, is to supplement your current consumption. But that debt will also impact the future, because you're trying to pay off the principal and the interest payments for that debt as well. So whenever you incur debt today, there's really a time path until in the future where you can either roll over that debt, which we can talk about, or you will pay it off at some point, right? So that's one of the big differences between the national or the government level debt and a personal debt. So a personal debt, because a person is finitely lived, medyo defined yung productive life ng person. The government, for example, is more long-lived, and therefore it can borrow for much longer periods, lower interest than any individual person. But sometimes not lower than a company. A company or a corporation is also very long-lived, right? Especially if it's a public company with shares in the public. So these long-lived governments and corporations, they have the option to pay off their debt slowly, or they can roll over their debt. So basically incur new debt to pay for the old debt. All right. So anyway, all of those macro statistics are very important for our lives and for the life of the country and for the future of the country as a whole. Next, politically speaking, macro performance and government policy as it relates to macroeconomics usually should be a factor politically for national governments. So may mga pag-aaral po in other countries that there's what's called a political cycle that is linked to a business cycle. So what that means, if you're like reading the term political cycle and business cycle, that means that governments in, for example, in the United States or in Europe, they are very much interested in managing short-term fluctuations in output, inflation, and debt. And managing pensions and pension systems as well, because it will hurt them politically at the voting booth. So what I think is very interesting is I think it's an open question in the Philippines whether output, GDP, and inflation and so on are top of mind as an election issue when it comes to voting for national government. Okay. But this is an established principle or fact that describes US presidential elections, for example, which is why medyo, for example, like you don't want, in the United States, for example, if you study these political cycles, you don't want to be the president that led to a recession or a depression during your term. You will definitely be voted out of office, and they'll try their best to not do that, even if it sacrifices other parts of the economy. We will see how a government can basically forestall a recession, and that can incur some costs, and some parts of the economy would need to basically incur some of that costs. Okay. Now, as such, because macro is so important, these statistics are heavily monitored, and the Philippine Statistics Authority, for example, is highly capacitated to do the best job they can given the budget restraints, to come up with good national level GDP, GNP, inflation, unemployment statistics, as well as balance of payment statistics, which come from the Bangko Sentral ng Philippines. So all of these statistics are very important, and they spend a lot of time, money, and effort to make sure that these statistics are, in fact, as accurate as they can be for the Philippines. Okay, so broadly speaking, for the definition of macro, ang daming pwedeng pag-usapan, right? So in this case, for future courses in macro, they'll likely focus on some of these specifically, right? And what we will be doing is basically a broad brush overview of all of these things. And you guys, as 101 students, I guess this is like your second course, maybe your first even, in macroeconomics. And then kung gusto nyo mag-graduate with a degree in economics with sort of like an interest in macro, then you can think about all of these different topics and then like really focus on a topic that you guys are interested in. And I would think that it's one of my tasks and goals to make sure that yung curiosity ninyo is sated, and you're sort of directed into a specific like subtopic in macro, because macro is so interesting and so huge that really you can spend entire semester just talking about one of these different things. And then ang dami mga open questions sa Philippines, so ang dami pwedeng pag-aralan, principally theoretically as well as empirically. So again, hopefully you guys will talk to me and talk to each other about the things that interest you in macroeconomics specifically. So let me give you a little thing about what can be done, or what is the usual topic of interest in macro. So first is growth. Growth itself. I already mentioned in the previous recording that growth and development tightly linked. So if you want to talk about development economics and growth economics as it relates to macro, that's essentially mirror topics. Yeah. You can do cross-country comparisons of growth, measurement of growth. What does that even mean? What does a growth of the economy even mean? Right? Growth strategies. Okay. As I'm sure you're aware, and this is one of the reasons maybe you're trying to study macro and studying economics, is there are these growth strategies for the Philippines. Ang daming mga, or growth strategies for developing countries, generally speaking, may mga success at saka may mga failures. Okay? So we can study both the successes and the failures of growth policies and growth strategies. So that will come later, and these are all basically you can spend an entire semester on on all of these things. And in this course, a 101 will basically just go through a lot of the big ideas here. What are the different growth strategies, and who was successful, who was not, and why, right? Broadly speaking. Right? So what is important? What are the factors leading to growth? What can impair growth? And a lot of growth and question mark, right? Growth and poverty. This is a major question in the Philippines because there was a big growth spurt recently in the 2000s for the Philippines, yeah. Especially before COVID, right? And one of the key questions there is, why is it even when we were growing, poverty wasn't going down as quickly? So if growth is average income, why is it that poverty is not really it is going down, but isn't going down as fast as, say, in India or in China, right? Growth and inequality, very much related, because inequality is a distributional issue. Even though average income might be rising, we would definitely be interested in making sure that all the sectors in the macroeconomy are basically enjoying that increase in income, right? There's also now, because of green issues, sustainable development issues, we can talk about how growth in output, or as we'll find out, it's the value of production in the economy, and also equal to the value of consumption or expenditure in the economy, how that's related to what's called sustainable development. How we can have both economic growth, increasing standards of living for people, increasing incomes and expenditure, and connect that to climate change and the ability of countries and of the world to basically not contribute too much to global climate change and to Philippine climate change, to make sure the climate in the future is not that different, not that worse than current or recent past's climate, that will also affect your standard of living in the future. Not to mention the entire sustainability or livability of the planet, of course. So these are important topics. And how do you reconcile or how do you get both sustainable development and economic growth at the same time? So ang daming pwedeng all of these topics are very, very interesting. And there's been a lot of work on all of these, but we'll try to hopefully introduce you to some of this work, and this can allow you to take the ball and go forward with it even further. So that's just growth, right? Mandami pang topic. Inflation. Recently, inflation has been a major topic. Why is it that, especially I want to talk about dito sa inflation as a topic. Inflation is an average. We'll find out later that inflation is the average change in prices, in a sense, based on a basket of goods. But you can think about that and how prices are determined at the market level and how that's aggregated up to the national level. So a lot of work now are sort of relating what's called micro level topics on price setting, price increases, and price setting and price increases at the micro level, to inflation and what's called price stability, or quote unquote price stability at the macro level. So those are some interesting things that will be introduced to this course. Employment or unemployment. Okay, so there's very, very important, of course. What's interesting about employment and unemployment is we're trying to now move away from standard, perfectly competitive labor markets. And then we're moving into labor markets that are marked with some kind of imperfection. So maghahanap ka pa ng trabaho, you're looking for jobs, people are trying to look for employees. So there's a friction there, people trying to search for each other, finders, people who need work and people who want workers, they're trying to find each other. And this kind of search model is very, very, very important. Also important dito sa employment is, in the Philippines specifically, is the OFW phenomenon. Labor essentially is leaving the country to enter labor markets in other countries, in very, very specific labor markets. So all of these are very, very interesting topics. This alone can be a semester in itself. Balance of payments and open economy. This is another course in entirety. It's called International Macroeconomics. In this case, we'll be talking about the transactions of the national level entity, a country, with other countries in the world, talking about both the flow of goods and the flow of money in the world amongst different countries. That's why it's called international macroeconomics. Dito rin pupunta ang exchange rate and the differences in an exchange rate determination by a country, or by different countries, or by groupings of countries. So some countries have come together to come up either with a common currency, or to just peg their currency to an established currency like the US dollar or the euro. Okay, those things are also possible. And we'll be talking about all of those different arrangements in future meetings. Now we talk about short-run income determination. Okay, so a lot of this course actually is about the basic theory about short-run income determination, meaning how is GDP determined in the short run, and how can government, using fiscal policy and monetary policy, sort of affect the level of GDP, and in this case also the price level, and the level of inflation, and the interest rates, all of these to affect income, the determination of GDP. And dito papasok really is the relationship, the very, very close relationship between these macro statistics, the theory relating to how these macro statistics are determined, and how government can influence that. So that's why this short-run income determination is really about how government can influence these macro statistics. And then, because of the focus really on the government and its role to influence macroeconomics, dito na papasok si public economics. How does the government deal with or understand taxation, or the different taxation models, and how it approaches debt, and whether there's going to be a problem with too much debt. And again, there are many historical, not just definitely in the Philippines, there have been historic bouts with what sustainable debt is and how much debt to have. Until now, we are definitely still having that debate. And there are other very spectacular failures in debt management in other countries, which we'll definitely be talking about. And you'll see that despite the fact that the Philippines does have this fairly large debt, we are not the worst, but they're definitely not the best either. And there are some really bad examples in other countries when it comes to debt. And how, when the government can't do its job properly because it's hindered or hampered by excessive debt or the inability to tax, okay, then a lot of other problems in the macroeconomy will also show up. We will talk about these hyperinflationary episodes, mass emigration from the country to other countries, to other neighboring countries. So all of that's why one of the reasons why studying this and making sure that you avoid these, worst case scenarios is such a top of mind topic when it comes to like macroeconomic managers sa Pilipinas, right? Okay. Now, there are other macroeconomic topics also in the short run and long run, and these are things that you should think about and think about studying. Maybe we'll be exposing you to all of these things, but all of these things can be a focus of your study here at UTSE. So, very popular thing to study is like manufacturing export sector, or even now services exports or labor exports. The export sector is the ability of a country basically to earn foreign exchange. Okay, it will add to our essentially GDP, right? And it will add to our ability to also purchase things from outside, because not everything in the Philippines, you cannot produce everything in the Philippines, right? And if you cannot produce everything in the Philippines, kailangan mong bilhin yun from outside. Okay, so an example is oil. For example, to import oil, you need to use dollars, and to get dollars, you have to earn dollars. And how do you earn dollars? Is by selling things to foreign countries, because in macroeconomics, in international macroeconomics, the US dollar is the currency that most countries use to denominate financial transactions. Although again, this is the nasa international macro yan, how different currencies are basically a world currency, and some countries like the United States, very United States issue, how its position as a global currency basically helps it and hurts it at the same time. And other things that you can study are banking and finance, because banking and finance are really important, because as you'll see, we will see the circular model of the economy. It's the flow of funds, the ability to move money from one sector to another, the ability to borrow, the ability to invest. These things are very important at the macro level, and that's why this is definitely a macro level topic. Real estate, because it's such a big chunk of the value in the Philippines and in other countries, real estate economics and the ability to use real estate in a productive manner, that's also very much a macro topic as well. Human capital development, as you'll see later in economic growth, human capital and training and knowledge, those are all important factors in how an economy grows. So human capital essentially is very, very important. And finally, and this is where I wanted to shout out the things that I'm also very interested in, there are these inefficient allocation of factors of production for various reasons. So you've got possibly political reasons, you've got fundamental structural reasons like risk aversion or lack of information, and you've got market power. So what happens here, this is again the intersection of micro and macro. So at the micro level, if factors of production are not efficiently used at the micro level, then that sort of multiplies over all of the different sectors, aggregating up to the macro level. And it will show up in the macro level as lowered output relative to what's called potential on GDP. So all of these things are very, very interesting and very important to think about. And I guess at the end of this course, I'd like to touch base with everyone. And, if you're interested in macro as a topic and what sort of topic you guys are interested in, I can help, point you in, in a new direction and things that you might not have realized. But all of these, this course basically is an ability for you guys to take this tour about all of these different macro topics and to figure out what you want to do for the rest of your time dito sa UPSC. If you're interested in macro, of course. So this class is an introduction to many of these issues. Now let's talk about some model building in economics, right? So this is an economics class, and perhaps you've had another econ class where they talked about economic models, right? So again, here in macro, models are very, very important. And in fact, when we read ManQ, the key takeaway from ManQ will basically be an understanding of the kinds of models that is done or is used in macroeconomics to understand how the different macro statistics are determined or generated and how they change over time. So in economics, and we will learn macroeconomic models and assess macro data in the light of these models, right? An example in economics of a model is the supply and demand model, right? And a model has an endogenous variable or variables. And endogenous variables are the ones that are determined within the model itself. So the model will generate output, which are the value of these endogenous variables. So a model has exogenous variables, and these exogenous variables are determined outside the model. But it's essential in determining the value of the endogenous variables. So a model should have both endogenous and exogenous variables. So ManQ discusses the supply and demand model. So let's go to that. In this version of the book, it's in page 9. And here he talks about endogenous variables and exogenous variables, where in this schematic, well, let me just change the share. Where in this schematic, he talks about endogenous and exogenous variables here in page 9. And in this schematic, basically explains that exogenous variables are fed into the model and endogenous variables are coming out of the model based on the values of the exogenous variables. An example of a model, exogenous and endogenous variables, is the demand and supply model. So here you can see there's the demand curve that you've probably seen in econ. I don't know what the previous one is, the intro to economics. Quantity demand, this is the demand function. And the demand function is a function of P and Y. P is the price of the good. In this case, it's pizza. And then Y is some exogenous variable called aggregate income Y. So that's this demand function here. And QD, okay, is a function of P and Y. And in this case, in this particular equation, this relationship that in the model determines what the quantity demanded is, which comes from consumers and their decision. The consumers will decide based on the price and based on their income. But the price here is still an endogenous variable, as well as the quantity demanded. Okay, and it's a Y here, or aggregate income, that is the exogenous variable. So it's determined outside of the demand and supply model. So demand pa lang yan. So here in demand, quantity demand is a function of price of the good and aggregate income. And then here you have the supply function. The supply function is the relationship between output supplied and the price that a seller receives. Okay, so this comes from modeling what firms choose to do when it comes to producing and how much to produce given the price. Okay, so given the price of the good, how much are they willing to produce? But here, the exogenous variable is PM. And what is PM? It's the price of materials or inputs to the production of the good. In this case, the production of pizza, which happens to be cheese, tomatoes, and so on. So all of the prices of all of these other goods, cheese, tomatoes, flour, all of these inputs are outside the demand and supply model for this particular good pizza. Okay, so that's why it's exogenous. In their own supply and demand models, So for example, the model or the supply and demand model for cheese and tomatoes and flour, these prices for these goods are endogenous in those models. But when it comes to the price of pizza and the quantity supply and demand of pizza, all of these inputs are outside the determination of the supply and demand for pizza specifically. And then finally, we have another or a final assumption here that relates both demand and supply. It equates quantity supplied and quantity demand. So these three equations comprise the market or the model specifically for the market for pizza. And then here you have an illustration which you've probably seen before, model of supply and demand, right? You've got a demand function, which is downward sloping with respect to the price. So the lower the price of pizza is, the more quantity demanded of pizza will be. And the supply function is upward sloping, in that the higher the price, the more producers will be willing to supply the product. What is endogenous here is the price of pizza and the quantity of pizza. And the model is the one that determines what the equilibrium price and quantity is, specifically by the equality of quantity demand and quantity supplied. So in this case, quantity demand, quantity supplied, you're trying to find the price that is associated with this equality. And that is illustrated here specifically in this picture. This is the price where quantity demand and quantity supplied are equated. And this picture itself is the entire market for pizza, or the supply and demand market model for pizza. The next illustrations come from what will happen if there's a change in the exogenous variables. So if you notice, these exogenous variables, again, are determined outside of the market for pizza. So they're not determined by the demand or supply of pizza. However, they definitely influence the price of pizza and the quantity demand of pizza. So in this case, an exogenous change in some variable that affects demand, in this case income, shifts demand to the right, and something that affects the cost of firms to sell will shift supply to the left. And these relate to an increase here in this case of demand. An increase in aggregate income will increase the demand for pizza, and an increase in the price of the inputs will shift to the left the supply of pizza. So that's just an example of a model in economics that features an endogenous variable and an exogenous variable, right? Now let's go to macro. In macro, there'll be many models, as you'll see, and each model has its own purpose, a reason why it was built. Okay, and we will be seeing that over time. So if in microeconomics, usually there's just the supply and demand, there's different like flavors of supply and demand. Hold on. Yes, I'm just checking if I'm screen sharing. Yes. There are still different models of supply and demand. Let me just share this one. Para it's clear. There you go. There are different models of supply and demand, but here there are definitely vastly different models of macroeconomics. There are short-run income determination, long-run income determination. There's models of open economy income determination. Lots of different models, right? Each of them have a purpose, and what's important in our study in this course is to know which model to use in a particular instance. There are also assumptions in modeling. There's assumptions in supply and demand models, and there are assumptions here in this course. So an important assumption moving forward will be sticky wages and sticky prices. So sticky wages and sticky prices, those mean that the prices and wages do not immediately adjust to clear markets. So we were just talking about the demand and supply of pizza, and in this simple model, if there's a change in demand, is a shift in demand or a shift in supply, that will definitely change the price and change the quantity demanded and quantity supplied. Pero in macro, there are all of these different models, all of these different supply and demand. You can think of a macroeconomy as a collection of different supply and demand models, all influencing each other in little ways because they're distantly related. But they all affect each other in a macro level. But some of these models, some of these markets rather, their prices change quickly when demand and supply conditions change. And on others, they don't change as quickly or there's a lag. So that's what the sticky wages and sticky prices mean. There's only a fraction of prices that change, that are adjusted at any given time. So this is an assumption. There's some good deal of work on this in developed countries. Like what exactly is the rate of change in individual level prices and how that relates to inflation and the assumption of sticky price models, broadly speaking. And there's some exciting new research in the Philippines regarding this. So I'm excited to share that with you. Another assumption is optimization by firms and consumers. There's this assumption, and as well as sticky wages and sticky prices, they'll usually be in the background of the models. So this is something that you implicitly like assume or accept. However, advanced theory and empirics in economics, and if you read a macro paper, it will definitely explicitly say, this is my assumption for sticky wages and sticky prices. This is my assumption on what the utility function is and how firms maximize its sales with respect to a consumer that has this utility function and so on. But in this course, Econ 101, all of these optimization of consumers and firms and sticky wages and sticky prices, they will be in the background in a lot of these models. It's something to just remember and think about what the implications of all of these different things are when it comes to different models. But for the models that we'll be talking about in this class, they'll be an important ingredient, but they won't be explicitly included in the model. Okay, so now let's talk about GDP. Okay, our final topic for today. GDP or gross domestic product. So, ang definition natin is technically, gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced within an economy in a given period of time. Okay. So, there are two ways of viewing it. So, let's think about this conceptually, right? Total income, which is called the income approach, or total expenditure on an economy's output and goods and services, or the expenditure approach over a given period of time. So there are two ways to think about macro data, GDP, and it's either the total income received by factors in the economy or the total expenditure. And as you'll see, they will be the same. So an economy is a collection of consumers and producers, which in macro is typically considered within the borders of the country, like we said. It need not be a country. It could be subnational or even regionally cross-national. Macroeconomic policy, though, is usually done at the level of the country. So this is also a continuing area of research, right? In some cases, macro policy is done in a wider area. An example basically is the USA or the Euro. So the USA is a collection of different countries, right? So for example, if you look at California, California is actually one of the, if it were its own country, it would be one of the top 10 countries in the world. Okay? But California on its own is subject to the federal government's macro policy. The EU is another example. Some EU policies are set at the EU level, especially monetary policy, because the euro is a common currency for all of the different countries, but all of the different countries are in fact independent in the euro, in the EU, even though they share the same currency. So in the Philippines, it would be interesting to think of NCR macroeconomy and how the NCR because the NCR is so big when it comes to the Philippines. You can think of my NCR, the country of NCR versus the rest of the country, the rest of the Philippines. And the rest of the Philippines basically, well, NCR has its own GDP, GNP, inflation rate, and the other countries, countries, the other regions surrounding NCR would also have their own these macro variables. Yeah. Now, the equivalent, these two approaches, the income and the expenditure, these are equivalent. And this can be seen in the circular flow model of the economy. And we can take a look at the circular model of the economy in Mankiw. This is page 19, chapter 2. So let's think about this one first. GDP is a flow. Okay, it's a flow of money, it's a flow of goods. It tells us the amount of pesos circulating in an economy in a given amount of time. The expenditure flow of pesos on products and services produced in a country are equal to the income received by factors of production, consumers and producers, as wages, rental, and profit. Okay, so let's move now to the book again. And look at the circular model here. So this is the circular flow model that will help us understand what's happening in the macroeconomy, right? And it will also help us think about the equality between the expenditure approach. So how much is spent in goods and services in the country versus the income of the factors of production within the country itself. Okay. So, eto siya. The figure illustrates the flows between firms and households in an economy that produces one good. For example, there's only one good and one input, labor. The inner loop, this one, represents the flow of labor and bread. Okay. Households sell their labor to firms. So here are households. They sell labor. So labor moves from the households and it goes to the different producers. And firms, okay, sell the output or the good, bread, back to the households. So there's a flow of factors of production here. Now, the outer loop shows the equality between expenditure and income. It represents the flows of money. So in this case, income, right, is earned by firms, but it's given back to the households in terms of wages, salaries, profits, rentals, and everything, right? So these are the income of the different factors of production. On the other hand, these factors of production, these households, they spend money on buying the goods that are produced by firms. And that is also, again, denominated in money. So that's why this is, well, it's circular in the sense that the output that the firms produce basically becomes income for the households. And the households use this income to, again, buy products produced by firms. And that's why the money goes around in a circular fashion, as well as the flow of factors of production themselves and the flow of final goods here. So this model shows how we have an equality between the total income received by factors of production and the total spending or total expenditure on final goods in production. And that's illustrated here in the circular flow model. So let's go back. Now, GDP, so GDP is a flow, right? So it's a flow of either income or expenditure. Now, this flow is measured in market value or in value. And this is in terms of pesos in the Philippines. This is how we're able to aggregate the production in an economy over a period of time because it's all in the same units, like pesos. So in a sense, So if you look at it from an income side, so you have the income of the different factors of production, capital and labor. All of these people, all of these factors, all of these people, think about people, they have income. Yeah? And this income will, of course, be determined in pesos, right? Meanwhile, the spending on goods and services are also in pesos. So even though what we're really interested in, in principle, what we're interested in is the value on the expenditure side, on the total amount of output produced in an economy. In order to add all of the different goods and services being produced in the economy as a total expenditure, all of these goods, you need to have a common currency or common unit, and the common unit is the peso denomination. So all of these products, all of these services are valued at their peso value. All right. Over a period of time. So specifically for GDP, you can imagine a listing of the total expenditure on goods and services, right? So GDP, this is on the expenditure side, expenditure on final goods and services. You can think of this as a summation of all of these different numbers, from product 1 to product 2 to product N. And then you're adding up all of the value because it's price of product 1 times the quantity purchased of product 1, the price of product 2 times the same quantity of the product purchased in product 2, and all the way to product N. So all of these products are being added up and valued in terms of prices, peso prices. All right, so what about used goods? So GDP is only about the production and expenditure, should be also expenditure in an economy in a given period of time within a year. If the goods had been produced earlier, then it's not counted. So used goods, for example, sale of used goods are not counted essentially in GDP. Similar story with inventories. So an inventory is essentially a used good. Matagal na siyang ginawa, before pa siya ginawa, but now it's sitting in the warehouse or sitting in a store, currently unbought by final consumers. So suppose that these were produced in the year but remain unsold, okay, that's included in GDP. Because again, what's important is these items, these final goods are produced within in the same period, in the same time period. This is included in GDP because in the GDP statistics, when the firms produce it, it's essentially also purchased by producers at the value in which it's sold. So that's a way of thinking about yung total output ng firms. It is essentially quote-unquote purchased, even though it's not ultimately consumed or purchased by the final consumer or by households. When this is sold later on, like after a year, it will then have no effect on GDP on that following year. In that case, the value of inventories, kasi nakalagay rin sa GDP ang inventories, inventory value will fall, and consumption will rise by the same amount. So total GDP is unaffected by sales out of inventories in the future, right? However, when in the year that it is produced, it will be included in GDP, and it will be purchased by producers and included as the total inventories produced in that year. All right, next concept. Products are usually produced as part of a value chain. So usually may inputs, we already talked about pizzas. There's inputs and then there's outputs to the pizza. But GDP only includes final goods production. Intermediate goods are part of the cost of the final goods and are already included in the production value of the final good. One way to compute this is using value added at each stage of production, which is one of the methods to calculate GDP. So basically, in concept, GDP is the sum of the market value of final goods in the economy, which is essentially, GDP is the sum of all of the different final goods. And implicitly, it already includes all of the intermediate goods, all of the goods that are used to produce the final goods. Now, the equivalent perspective is what's called the expenditure approach. So now we've focused on yung income approach and yung production approach, right? Which is the value of all of the final goods and services, right? And you can think about that as an income and under the expenditure approach. So now let's think about the expenditure approach when it comes to the value of the final goods and services, GDP, in a particular year. So the value of all of these goods and services will be divided between, in general, these four different categories: consumption, investment, government, and net exports. Okay. So let's go through the the definitions of all of these different expenditure categories that make up the expenditure approach. So una, consumption consists of goods and services bought by households. Okay. So these are the household components of consumption. So you can imagine all of these final goods and services, are being produced. And this describes ultimately who consumes it, right? So some of these products are going to be bought during the year by households, and that will be reflected here in consumption. There are three categories: non-durable goods, durable goods, and services. So typically, they'll just be different in actual national income accounts. You'll have these different kinds of consumption per household, for the households at the household level. So that's C. So let me just put C here, C. So what is investment? That's I. I consists of goods bought for future use. Okay. Investment is divided into three subcategories: business fixed investment, capital formation, residential fixed investment, or inventory investment. We already talked a little bit about inventory investment up here, right? In inventories. Okay. Remember that if it's produced in a year, if product is produced in a year and it happens not to be bought by consumers, it will not be here in C, but it will show up here in I as an increase in inventories. So that's why it's called an inventory investment. So businesses basically purchase their output, put them into storage, and that's what the inventory is. So that's when inventory, the production of those inventory goods was counted. That's when in the year that they were produced and the year they were first put into inventory. So that's investment. You can think about investment essentially as goods for future use. Inventory is one of them. Capital is also important because you use capital. Your capital is a generated factor of production. You produce capital to be able to produce more products and services in the future. So that's why you spend money now on capital in order to produce more products and services in the future. The same thing with residential fixed investment. You are spending money on residential investment now. You're building houses and condos in order to fulfill residential consumer demand today and tomorrow. All right, now, government purchases are goods and services bought by, this is from the MANQ definition, federal, state, and local governments. It's the same as in the Philippines. It's the government has government consumption and government investment. So dito papasok, well, actually in the G, it's really about government consumption and government investment. Both similar definitions here, except that now it's the ones that are purchased by the government. Next is net exports. Net exports are the value of goods and services sold to other countries minus the value of goods and services that foreigners will sell us. This is inputs. So why is it net exports, right? Because these represent spending on Philippine production, okay, not just by us, okay, but by people from outside. So if we are on net, well, before thinking of it on net, let's think of each component specifically. So if we export a good to another country, this represents Philippine final good production consumed by other people from outside of the country. Okay. And that is counted in GDP positively because we're producing, except that if the household is not, the final consumption is not going to be here in the Philippines, it's going to be elsewhere. Now, when we buy goods and services from other countries, that is not part of domestic production, yes? So if it's not part of domestic production, that means you have to subtract it from the GDP figures. So specifically, if Filipino households import a consumption good from abroad, that will increase consumption, but that will also increase imports. So that's why GDP will be unchanged. So tataas si C, magiging mas negative si NX, and that will cancel each other out. So the fact that it's net exports really focuses the fact that GDP, even at the expenditure level, GDP is really about the expenditure on final goods and services produced in the country over some period of time. Okay. Our final topic is to talk a little bit about the data, the GDP data of the Philippines. Okay, how is GDP data actually computed, estimated, I should say. That's the key term. Ito siya, estimation. How the Philippine GDP is estimated in the Philippines. Now, if you go to Matthew, let's go back. There is a discussion about how the BLS computes GDP. Well, it's along here somewhere. Like, for example, let me just highlight this one. Housing services and other imputations, right? So in the United States, ang housing service, some data needs to be imputed, meaning we don't necessarily have data on the total amount of production for that particular good or service, okay? That's how we empirically measure GDP, which is to measure all of the different productions of final goods and services, yeah? But for some of these different goods and services, we don't really have exact or specific data. And one example here is housing services. And in the United States, and even in the United States, there are imputed values. Okay. If GDP is to include the value of these goods and services, we must estimate their value. Now, some of this is because sometimes they are not really sold in a particular market, right? So that's one of the key issues here in housing services. So if you buy your own house, for example, you don't pay yourself housing costs or a rental to yourself. That's one of the things that's implicated here. And that's one of the reasons why they would need to impute housing services as part of GDP. Okay. So yung housing expenditure, housing consumption on housing services. Housing imputations also come in when it comes to valuing government services, especially those that have no corresponding market value. Okay. An example here are these public goods Public goods, which is something that you might have studied in the past. Public goods are normally not provided using market methods, not sold in a marketplace with a given price or a price schedule. And therefore, they need to somehow estimate the value of these goods and services. And that's why they need to impute. Now, as you'll see, there's also a lot of imputation in the Philippines. So in the Philippines, we use the production approach to generate, well, it's exactly the same as in ManQ actually in the United States. That the production approach is used, and there is a methodology when it comes to determining what the total GDP is with regard to this production approach. Now, what's important from a theory perspective is that when you do production approach, this should be equivalent to both the income determination and the expenditure side of GDP because of the circular flow economy. Except that when it comes to actually collating data from an economy, the PSA in the Philippines or the BLS in the United States will typically use like production data, production surveys, administrative data, and that's how they are able to basically determine how much GDP is. And in this section, we will describe exactly what the production approach is when it comes to the estimation of GDP. Okay. So a lot of this goes for the United States as well as in the Philippines, right? Except that in the Philippines, there's a bit more, because we cannot do quarterly surveys of the different firms. There's a lot more of imputation within the year, okay, as you will see. So this is just, again, the definition of GDP, right? GDP is the sum of the gross value added for all resident producer units. So again, we're focused on units or factors or firms that are in a particular country at a given time. They're producing final goods. Now, what is this new concept called gross value added? So let me now introduce this gross value added concept. So remember that we are talking only about the value of final goods. Where did we talk about that? Here. Right? GDP only includes the value of final goods. Intermediate goods are part of the cost of final goods. So in order to determine what the value of the final goods are, you would talk about value added. Okay. It's defined as the value of output less the value of intermediate consumption that's required to produce the output. So this is exactly what we were talking about earlier. And this is exactly the method of how final expenditure on final goods is actually determined in practice, which is to calculate gross value added. Okay. So let's continue. Output is defined as the goods and services produced by an establishment. It's equal to the value of sales adjusted for the changes in inventories of finished goods. That is goods produced and ready for sale but not yet sold, or goods sold or adjusted for sales of goods produced in an earlier period, right? We were just talking about an inventory earlier. That's exactly what this is, right? If the inventory is sold now, then that's part of consumption, right? But if it's not, then it will be part of inventory investment, like we mentioned earlier. Meanwhile, intermediate consumption consists of the value of goods and services consumed as inputs by the process of production. Okay, so remember that we're not interested in the inputs to the value of final goods consumed finally as a final good, but we want to somehow take away this intermediate consumption. GDP is based on the concept of gross value added. The production measure of GDP is derived as the value of output less intermediate consumption, plus any taxes, less subsidies on products not already in value of output. So this is GDP operationally speaking, right? Operationally speaking, at the production of the PSNA, that's the Philippine System of National Accounts, it's compiled for industries, which allow the study of industrial activity and permits the compilation of supply and use tables and input and output tables. Okay. So the sectoring here is based on the 2009 Philippine Standard Industrial Classification System. Now, the aggregates referring to the output and intermediate consumption are neither asked in surveys nor censuses. For instance, businesses do not directly measure their intermediate usage of goods and services. Rather, they record their purchases and the change in inventories of fuel materials. These are derived data from the specific items processed from the results of establishment surveys, household surveys, and as administrative data. So what this is saying is that when we want to compute for GVA in the Philippines, we'd have to actually try to connect all of these different surveys that the PSA and the BSP do and somehow determine what the intermediate output is and separate that from the final goods and services or the gross output, right? So the gross output, eto siya. This comes from this data from firm surveys. So if you have, the Philippines usually runs a firm survey every year, and then they have revenue from the main activity, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. These are the different things that are asked. Right? This is gross output. Less intermediate consumption, materials and supplies. So these are the intermediate consumption that's based on all of that, right? All of the firms that were surveyed. Now, what's gross value added? Gross value added is the sum of value added for each of the 16 industries in the Philippine System of National Accounts. So described here, right? So you have gross value added per sector, and then you're adding that up, and that will become GDP. So notice that this is precisely, this sort of formulation is exactly what this is. Whereas here, you are interested in the summation of all the different final goods. And here, you're interested in the summation of gross value added for the entire economy. So that's exactly equivalent. Now, you can measure GVA at an industry level, okay? Because in order to get these 16, that's the different industry classifications, and that's how you measure the GVA. What's important or interesting about the Philippines is we have what's called the organized industry and what can kindly be called an unorganized industry. So these are some of the very Philippine or very developing country specific problem that hindi mo makikita sa US. Okay. So specifically in the US, organized industry is above and beyond super big. And in fact, what's called an underground or informal economy, which is another word for this, is a small amount of the United States economy. But in the Philippines, it's a large enough amount that you really have to include the unorganized industry in order to have a better understanding of GVA at the industry level. And when you're summing up GDP, because all of the GVAs are just being added up, all of the GVAs at the industry level are just being added up together. So ano ang ibig sabihin ng organized industry and unorganized industry? Organized industry includes establishments and the government as producers of market output for own use, non-market outputs. So these come from, again, the measuring the GVA is done at the most detailed level possible. Five-digit level PSIC. Okay. And, well, part of the definition kasi of organized is here. Goods and services that are captured. Dito not captured. So in unorganized industry, goods and services not captured in formal establishment surveys like the ASPBI and CPBI. These are the surveys done annually or every like 4 or 5 years by the Philippine government. If it's not coming from the formal establishment surveys, then that is called unorganized industry. Okay, so the formal surveys only capture ito, right? From the basic level of the JF industry. This comes from what's called the organized industry. Now, what about yung unorganized industry? How do you measure that? By definition, yung unorganized, hindi mo na ma-measure. Hindi siya kasha, hindi siya mina-measure sa establishment surveys where you go to the different companies, formal companies, and ask them about, the total gross output, the inputs that they used, and so on. So in the Philippines, where this unorganized or informal economy is so important, how do we go about measuring that? Well, we call it the residual employment approach. So this is how we sort of think about how unorganized industry is measured. Okay. So this is a very interesting measurement, interesting and also necessary for the Philippines, right? So baka this is something that you can think about when it comes to yung macro news about the size of the informal economy and how to measure the informal economy. Okay, so under this approach, employment in the unorganized industry is derived as the residual of the employment of the labor force survey and the CPBI for the benchmark year or the ASPBI for the non-benchmark years. So ang ibig sabihin po nito is that the labor force survey is asked not to companies, not to firms, but to people. So maghahanap sila ng tao and say, are you employed? Are you not employed? And then they'll come up with an employment statistic, a national level, a regional level employment statistic. Excuse me. And this statistic is based on people that they survey using the labor force survey. Itatapat nila yung number na yan dun sa benchmark employment sa ASPBI and CPBI. And yung makikita mo dito is, syempre, mas mataas ang makukuha mong labor employment sa LFS kesa sa CPBI and sa ASPBI. And in particular, look at this equation 1. You'll see that the employment in the unorganized will be the employment that comes from the estimated employment from the LFS, where again, this is a survey of people. So you're looking at people. And then you're subtracting the employment estimate from your survey of firms. And the assumption here is that all of the people who are not employed here, they are employed somewhere else informally, or they're freelancers, their own employees, their own employers, I should say. Now, once you have this value of employment, okay, you are going to now assume, and this is again one of the limitations of Pilipinas, is that the employment of unorganized, you multiply it by the gross output per capita of small businesses that are in the ASPBI and are in the CPBI. And those are the two establishment level surveys. So you're gonna say, okay, you have this much employment, unorganized, and I am going to say that these people are quote unquote employed in the informal sector and are about as productive as these small firms in the formal sector. So there's an implicit assumption in equation 2 that the employed informal people basically produce the same amount as the smaller formal businesses, except that they choose not to be formal, they choose not to pay taxes in a sense, they choose to not go through the formal government processes of you have to file a business permit and so on and so forth. So this can be potentially very big, and I think one of the things that I'd want to estimate really is this equation here, very, very crucial, very, very important in determining the size of the gross output of this informal sector. So there's a lot of assumptions going into this very interesting second equation here. And now finally, the GVA. So remember, we're in GDP, right? The GDP is again the sum of the GVAs. This is the formal GVA, and this is the total GVA for the different subsectors. And then you will get essentially a GVA of unorganized, which is the gross output of unorganized multiplied by, again, this has an assumption built in that you've got the same GVA from these small companies from the formal sector. They are the best guide, the best estimate for the GVA for the unorganized. And that's how you are able to calculate this one. By multiplying this one that comes from the formal side to the estimated gross output here. All right. And finally, the GVA for each sector J is just the organized times the unorganized. Okay. So you put these together, and that will become the GVA for that sector. So this is something that's very, very Philippine specific, and I wanted to make sure that everyone understood it, that measurement of GDP in the Philippines has these two different components, right? The informal component, informal side, and the formal side based on our surveys of ASPBI and CPBI. And I guess this is one of the interesting macro research is the interaction between the informal and informal parts of the economy and whether it's good to move people from the informal. Well, it's definitely going to be good to move them from the informal to the formal in the sense that they'll be paying taxes, participating more widely in the economy. But one of the key questions is, as you're moving from unorganized to organized, one of the things that people are hoping is that their productivity and the quality of the products will also rise. Okay. So which is why these assumptions here are sort of an upper level limit, right? We're saying here that these informal individuals are producing at a similar level as formal small firms. But a lot of the macro literature, development literature dealing with moving from an informal part of the economy to the formal part thinks about, an increase in total productivity, right? So this is like the small, this underestimates the total output that can be produced by these people if they move from informal to formal. That's something that you guys can think about as well. All right. Okay, so we will end with this particular page. So this is already the last page. So in the Philippines, the expenditure and income approach will differ. Okay. So, and the difference is the statistical discrepancy. Okay. So Virola in the paper that I cited earlier will say that the income approach is more reliable, and that's why the expenditure approach here will suffer from a statistical discrepancy. And makikita mo yan sa official GDP statistics ng Philippines, that the statistical discrepancy account, essentially, is in the expenditure breakdown of GDP. Okay. Expenditure now is determined using commodity flow approaches. So again, we want to come up with total consumption, total investment, government spending, and so on. But these are coming from commodity flow approaches, which are coming from retail and wholesale trade surveys, household income and expenditure surveys, FICE in the Philippines, and these may not be annual or quarterly. So this is the commodity flow table. So statistical agencies will fill in a table like this, right? So if you can imagine, as you can see, group 1, and there's different commodities here, right? You have the different industry setup, right? Meron kang outputs, and all of these different ones. And the whole point of this one is to determine the output of each industry. So you can imagine the whole goal of that whole GVA thing is to calculate all of these numbers here. The only question is, how do you translate this output for each industry? How do you then determine expenditure? How do you cut that up into C, I, G, and NX? So dito pumapasok si commodity flow table. So that statistical industry agencies will fill in a table like above, then allocate the supply which they calculated using the GVA approach. And they will allocate them to intermediate consumption and other consumption categories like household final consumption, etc. So this will be done by type of products, as seen here, raw materials, and so on and so forth. Typically, there'll be ratios based on past data to fill in these cells. So merong mga past data, mga dating pag-aaral to determine really how much is of a particular industry goes to final consumption, how much goes to government, etc. So there's a lot of imputation here based on past data and studying past flows of output going to consumers, households, government, private businesses as investment, and so on. And that all of that information comes from regular data, such as regular data collection efforts, from PSA, such as retail wholesale trade surveys, household income and expenditure surveys, but these are not regularly collected. Like, for example, the FIES is collected every 3 years, if I'm not mistaken. And then that's how the different GVAs from the different industries are allocated expenditure-wise to consumption, investment, government spending, and ultimately also net trade balance or net exports. So there's a lot of production of, like, for example, there's a document called Sources and Methods, which let me finally share that with you right now. So this is a document from PSA, Sources and Methods on how to compute for the domestic gross domestic product. And instead of going through the entire document, which is quite voluminous, it will essentially describe everything that I've talked about so far. Chapter 1 deals with some basic definitions. What's the boundaries? We will be talking next week about the revision and rebasing. So next week, we'll be finishing our discussion of GDP by talking about the rebasing concept about real GDP as opposed to nominal GDP. And then how the supply and use tables, this is what the commodity flow method uses, how the commodity flow, how the supply and use tables are used to transform GVA outputs into the expenditure side of GDP. And this describes the overall statistical infrastructure and some more details about how these expenditures are produced. The statistics are produced, and then some expenditure, some general methods. And I think I'll end here in chapter 5. So let's jump directly. So this is exactly what I presented earlier. Okay, so you can find it here in this document. I will try to upload this document because this is very, very interesting. This will definitely be part of your exam. This chapter 5 specifically, the production approach. And here you've got the expenditure approach. Methods and data used to derive quarterly price estimates are consistent. 2 basic approaches are used, the direct measurement of current prices. Well, we can talk about this later on, like next week specifically. And yeah, that's it. Yeah. So let me go back to lecture 1. All right. So that's how GDP is actually essentially computed in the Philippines. Okay, so we'll skip these exercises. And we will end here with real or nominal, and then we will talk about other topics here, GDP versus GNP next week. All right, so real versus nominal GDP. So nominal GDP uses current period prices to value output. So NGDP is basically the price times quantity, right? You can also think about this as GVA valued at current prices. So again, we've done that equivalence, right? This is again the sum of all final goods priced at today's or this year's prices, and you can think about this as the sum of GVAs, the GVAs valued at current prices. Meanwhile, real GDP is when we fix prices to a base year. And the base year here is given generically as B. So real GDP at time T is the prices based on whatever the price level was on the base year price B, multiplied by the amount or the quantity produced in a specific year of final goods in a specific year. So what's important here is that the valuation is based on a base year. And again, finally, you can think about this as a GVA valued at the base year prices as opposed to current prices. From this, you can calculate what's called a GDP deflator, which is simply the ratio between RGDP and NGDP. That's it's actually here. GDP is equal to NGDP divided by RGDP. Actually, that would that. NGDP and NGDP. How do we calculate real GDP in practice? I will defer that to next week because that's part of our empirical exercise and how to look at empirically GDP. So we'll be doing some GDP computations on paper on the board next week. It's really much easier to do it in person anyway as opposed to online. But right now, what we want to end up with is the knowledge that GDP can be real and it can be nominal. And what we're really interested in here is yung real GDP, because we're interested in the total output, really, the Qs, right? The total output, right? We're interested in the value of output in any given year, but the problem is the GDP as measured by this is actually a product of two things, the price and the quantity. So what we're really interested in is how much people are producing, how much people are selling of goods and services. The price is really there to value them, to come up with a common unit and to add them all up. But what we're interested in here really is called real GDP because we're sort of taking a price vector or certain prices constant over time, and that we were using those prices to value output so that you can, when you plot real GDP, you have confidence that you're plotting the actual growth of output over time. Okay. Now, statistically, that's what we're going to do next week. We're going to look at what a real GDP series would be and the nominal GDP series would be and how to calculate it using actual empirical, like toy figures, toy numbers, but really an example of this NGDP distinction versus real GDP. All right. That's all for now. Oh, wait, maybe. Can we have a copy? Yes, this will definitely be produced or shared once we're done with this lecture. Hindi pa tayo tapos. Next week, matatapos pa to. All right. Ang dami pa tayong topics. Some of this will be skipped because some of these are too advanced, I would think. And we will go to CPI. We'll finish up next week with CPI and unemployment. And of course, again, we will start next week with an empirical investigation of yung real GDP versus nominal GDP. All right. Doon tayo nagtatapos today. How do we stop share? And that's our recording. I will again save this. I'm going to stop the recording now.